I'm going to introduce each speaker one at a time before they speak. So we'll begin with Richard Cizek. And after he speaks for about 20 minutes, there will be time for 1 or 2 questions precisely for him. And then when that's done, we will have our next speaker. I will introduce the next speaker. The next speaker will speak. Again, 1 or 2 questions for that speaker, and then the third speaker, and so on through the fourth speaker. At the very end, we'll have a free-for-all, time for questions for anyone, all right? And so that's how that will happen, all right? So without further ado, our first speaker is Reverend Dr. Richard Cizek. He was, in the past, the Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals and one of the most prominent evangelical lobbyists in the United States. After leaving the National Association of Evangelicals, in 2008, he founded the new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. And he also serves as consultant on government affairs for Interfaith Power and Light, which has chapters in 40 states. He has also served on the board of advisors of the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. His talk for us today is titled, An Evangelical Prognosis, Confirmation Bias Run Rampant in an Age of Trump, or a Demographic and Political Opportunity. Richard.
Thank you, Tobias. It's sure great to be with you all. I'm so pleased. I've been here for the entire time, and I have to say I'm very humbled by so many brilliant people all in one room at the same time. So I am a clergyman, unlike a scientist, and so I'm going to come at things something differently. Heather had said just a moment or two ago, she said she might not copyright it, namely that religion always gets the last word. Because I've spent most of my time in the last 30 years as a lobbyist in Washington, I'm going to emphasize this, one of the 7 C's. Now, if you heard Cardinal Peter on Sunday night, you heard him talk about the 7 C's, right? You remember that? Remember, one of them was civic. And so we're going to shift away from some of the other traditions and talk about our ecological civic responsibility together for just a few minutes. At least I am, and the others may talk about religion. No, I'm joking. I want to tell stories. I am a clergyman. I don't preach every Sunday, but I do often enough, and if you know a clergyman, you know he's not afraid to preach, and he's not afraid to tell stories. So one of my favorites that I always tell goes like this. An American is riding his Jeep Cherokee. He's going over hill and dale. He slams on the brakes. He walks out to the shepherd who's quietly tending his sheep, and he says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you how many sheep you have, can I have one?" Shepherd's totally dumbstruck, doesn't know what to say. He says, "Well, of course, sure." So anyway, the American goes back in, gets on GPS. That's God's positioning satellite. You know that. And within a matter of moments, he has it, 1,638 sheep. He walks out to the shepherd. He says, "Sir, I have it. You have 1,638. The shepherd says, "That's totally amazing. How did you know? Go pick one out." Well, the American goes over. You've heard the story? Anyway, the American goes over, picks one out, and he's driving away. And the shepherd runs up to the Jeep, knocks on the window, and he says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you what you do for a living, can I have my sheep back?" And the American says, "Oh, that's a good bet." We heard about bets here in the last few days. "That's a good bet." The shepherd says, "You are a consultant." And the American says, he's just dumbstruck. He says, "How did you know?" He says, "Well," the shepherd says, he says, "first of all, you came into my world to answer questions I've never posed. Second of all," well, you can leave that one out. You charged me a lot of money. And lastly, he says, "You don't know diddly squat. You took my sheepdog." So I feel sort of like as a clergyman coming into scientists, you know, like this August gathering of all of you. Wow. I have to be a consultant to you maybe on the behalf of evangelicals, but although I think Mitch is more than qualified to do that as well. He'll speak. But I have some things I want to say, and I've got to do it all in 20 minutes. So I'm just going to touch upon 3 different themes. The first of which, since it may be surprising to some who will view this later, I don't think it'll be surprising to you, who view it now, live stream or later, that there is an evangelical in your midst, more than one in fact, who happens to believe that this is the most compelling issue facing humanity. In fact, we're at one of those, as Peter Doppelt says, Power of Sustainable Thinking, that's his book title, he says, we're at one of those defining moments. And he says it's because we're talking about energy. Whether it's 300,000 years ago when man first learned how to use fire to heat his food and stave off disease, or whether it was hundreds of years, thousands of years later when we had the Industrial Revolution, and then, lo and behold, coal, and then after that, electricity and the like. At every point in time, he argues when you have this kind of shifting going on, all kinds of other things happen. Not just in the energy world, but in politics, in society, culture, and religion. And so I happen to believe we are at one of those moments. Okay, we're at a Catholic. I have to tell one Catholic story. It's one of my favorite. It's not a joke. It's very serious. It comes from, if you don't know the name, you should, John Courtney Murray. And he says, look, like Augustine in the 5th century, all these centuries later, we have to deal with complex issues. And he says, it's not incumbent on us to do anything like hand-wringing. He says, we need to just get on with the task. But he says, in counseling against, hand-wringing, he says, it's as if the surgeon is in the midst of gastroenterostomy. We're to say that the complex situation in front of him is full of paradox. First of all, he says, the patient is at the same time as he's receiving blood, he's losing blood. Paradox. Irony. Half a stomach's better than a whole one anyway, right? No laughs. After eating lunch. And dilemmas. Not too much, not too little anesthesia. But all surgical solutions are necessarily ambiguous. And the issues which we have, not the issue per se, I don't think it's ambiguous. I think it's very clear. And my constituency, by 50%, gets it, and by a much smaller percent believes it, that it's human-caused. So that's a little bit of evidence, first of all, that it may be complex for some people to understand. But about its apparentness, no debate. At least not from this person, not from this evangelical. And so I just happen to think that we are going to have to learn to think and see a whole lot more clearly. And one of my favorites on this is, you may have heard of him, his name is Thomas Merton. In Things in Its Identity, he says, a tree gives glory to God by being a tree. And it consents to his creator's love, he says, by being a tree. And all of creation gives glory to by being what it is. Well, what is our duty? Our duty is to be that steward, right? We heard that from Peter and all the other speakers. We know that. That's not something I'm telling you. But what I will say to you, that it was new to me. You do polling today to evangelicals, and then you ask, well, just go to Google. Google evangelicals, and there was a big summit at Wheaton University just a few days ago among evangelical leaders who are conflicted by what's going on in the Trump administration and by everything else that's happening around us, especially to the term. And they said, you Google that term and you come up with Trump. Totally amazing. The evangelical movement has spent decades, if not centuries, trying to clarify its vision. It doesn't have a common good vision, but it certainly has a vision of compassion and care for the others, and it's all being sublimated under Trump. Wow. Deadly. And so I happen to think this issue of thinking more clearly about our civic responsibility is really important, especially for scientists and evangelicals to do together. Pause. I first met Peter Reverend at an evangelical scientist summit in Georgia about, 12 years ago. And it was followed up by an event in Shishmaref Island in Alaska in which, get these names, Jim McCarthy, Peter Raven, first of all, Jim McCarthy, the others include Carl Safina. He's a oceanographer. You have a botanist. You have Jim McCarthy, who's a scientist, former head of every society there is, all together on Shishmaref, and we're waking up at 3 in the morning to go out to see the first eclipse of the moon in 30 years. And we see not just the eclipse, I do, but we see 3 shooting stars and we see the Aurora Borealis all at once on one evening. And I'm walking there in the middle of the morning with some of these scientists, and I say, to my brain, I say, I got to remember this. And I'm remembering it back and telling you about it because my very first point is not just about thinking and seeing more clearly. It's about getting each other's back. And we really need to take care of each other's back because we're not doing it a very good job. We're not doing this very well at all. And so the identity we're going to have is not just that steward, but I would say to you, well, let me just ask you, raise your hand. Put you on the spot. Raise your hand if you have an evangelical friend. Not bad, pretty good. But I can tell you that if you go into an evangelical audience and you ask the same question, raise your hand if you have a scientist as a friend. You're laughing, Peter's laughing. No. In fact, I did a survey in 2008, just before the Obama election, on, who are your friends? This is the board of the National Association of Evangelicals. 100 people, 99% were all Republicans. Big surprise. I asked also in the survey, being the head of government affairs, I said, because this was 2008, not long after 2001, and I said, do you know a Muslim? No, hardly, a few, seldom. That's the reality, and this is what we face. And so I'm saying, look, we got to really think this through and start something different and build the relationships, because I'm here because I know Pat and Peter. And I was asked by Dr. Winwright. But I'm just saying, for every you who didn't raise your hand and everyone who did, this is your first task leaving here. It's not that hard. You can do it. You heard that last night. We can do this from Bill Nye. But will we? I'm not sure at all. I mean, changing is hard. Margaret Mead said, the only one who wants to change is a wet baby. And so will we change? And, scientists need a conversion. I say to evangelicals, I'll tell you what happened to me. They need a conversion, but we scientists, or those of you who are scientists here, need a conversion too. I'll tell you why. Because many, particularly environmentalists, believe they have the perception that climate protection and sustainability is all about the natural environment. Answer, wrong. It's about us. It is about all of us. It's about altering the way in which humans imagine, design, and build social systems. All of these things. And we're going to have to be able to do that in ways that are mindful. And one of the mindful ways is we've got to bring people along, and the evangelicals need to be brought along. And they're not going to do it with more information. You're not going to give them more science and persuade them, because they engage. You heard me at the title. What's it called? Well, they take information and simply refute it. With the more information you give them, the more they refute what you're trying to persuade them of. Do you follow me? Information bias. And it's motivated reasoning that motivates them to believe the way they do. And a lot of it is politics that comes before even religion. That's my first point. My second point is caring more deeply. You know where we are in society, but let me cite for you what Robert Putnam and David Campbell in American Grace, that came out just a few years ago, say. In surveying 40,000 people, 30,000 people in 41 communities, and they say, here's the short version, by the way. People in diverse settings don't want to have much to do with each other. Social capital erodes. Diversity has an apparent downside. People withdraw, distrust their neighbors, expect the worst of others, agitate for social reform, most importantly, but have less faith that they can make a difference, and they hunker down. And so this business of not just thinking is caring more deeply. And if you care about this planet, you will care about building those relationships and overcoming what is this circumstance in our society. Now, I don't know you, and I'm not going to ask your hands, but if you turn on the news and watch it as I do, you almost have to turn it off. The polarized society we're in, and frankly, the anti-environmental agenda of Donald Trump is almost too much for me. Thursday, I was in the Department of Interior on the methane issue presenting a petition when, frankly, we weren't sure they were even going to greet us or meet us to receive it. So I had to embarrass the secretary's office by saying that in travels in China, on behalf of religious freedom and others, the Chinese at least now receive our petitions. I've done that. They receive it. They accept it. For many, many years prior to Bill Clinton's journey and the like, no, they wouldn't even receive it. But at least in our own administration, as fellow Americans, they ought to receive the petition, right? So they did come and they took a picture of us. But that was the sum and substance of our interaction with Secretary Zinke's office. And I think, frankly, even on tape, I'm willing to say, I think that's pretty pathetic. And so, wow. What does it mean to care more deeply? We care more deeply, you've heard from so many speakers, for so many different reasons, but I say we care more deeply because God cares intimately. And he cares. This is one of the most surprising things I've learned over all the years. It was really hard for me to accept, and I'll admit it, that he is not going to save any of creation if he doesn't solve and save all of it. Do you understand what I'm saying? You know, this is a fundamental truth, namely human and non-human, living and non-living, all of these he cares about, and if he's going to save any of it, he has to save all of it. That's right. But you see, for evangelicals, it's about us. And they're not willing always to go that far. But I'm telling you, we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to go that far. One of my quotes I'll share with you is Annie Dillard. Do you know her? Just bear with me. It's only a paragraph long, but let me share it. Because we're at this point, which is my third point, of not just seeing and thinking more clearly and caring more deeply, but being more bold. Here it is. On the whole, I do not find Christians out of the catacombs sufficiently sensible of conditions. Does anyone have the foggiest idea of what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It's madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. I think this is really good. They should lash us all to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake up and take offense, or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return. To which I say, draw us out to where we can never return. Perhaps that's all where we need to be in order to understand the circumstances that we're in, to act differently. And if you don't act differently as opposed to hearing me for 10 or 15 minutes and I'm about to shut up, then I will have failed. But I think we cannot depend on our technology, our intelligence, our degrees. Now I'm getting close to home. We can't depend on our degrees, our wealth, our strength, or all of these things. And so I'm asking for a dangerous kind of hope. The anxious country where our yearning is most precarious and hence our hope most real is when we are that feeling that so dangerously explosive with the powers of God to share and shape the country we live in. Are you with me? And let me be final in saying, in the abstract world of ecological ethics, too much attention is given to the specific, to this idea, namely that we have a consequentialism about us that says, if it's going to work and if it's going to change things, then I'm going to do it because I do the right thing. And the dominant ethic, if not anything else in this society, is a consequentialism that says, well, it's got to be good enough to do or I'm not going to do it. And so I would say to you, well, what if it's not true? What if climate change isn't real? What if we aren't? I was reminded last night, but I think it was Heather, that it's not 3 species that go extinct every day, but it's something like 30. If it was 10,000 a year 20 years ago, it's probably a lot more now. And I need your relationships in order to communicate these truths to my fellow parishioners, my friends and others. I need that relationship for you to cover my back so that we can care together more deeply and we have to act more boldly. Now, one last one. I grew up out on the West on the farm. I went to graduate school, and then I went to seminary and ended up working, of all places, at the Evangelical Association in Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan had just been elected, and I'm saying, wow, I'm such a kid. I've got all this in front of me. And for the next 20 years until 2002, it never crossed my mind, any of these things. In fact, when I was asked, apparently in the 90s, about joining EEN and the rest for the NAE, I said, are you kidding me? We're never going to do that. I said, no. That was me. I changed. I changed because, get this, not because some preacher preached at me, because I went to the Oxford Conference on Climate Change in 2002, invited by a scientist, Sir John Houghton, co-founder of the IPCC. It was scientists that converted me. You know what they converted me to? They converted me to my stewardship duty. Wow. Think about that for yourself. Whether you believe in, this reality that I believe gives us the hope of all hope, that God is real, that he's the center of all things, and God's good future is the most certain reality. And so if that's all true, and I believe it is, then what you do and how you relate to other people on this subject is probably one of the most important things you will ever do. And I would say we can talk a little bit less about what we can and must do and about who we can and must be. Who we can and must be as caretakers of creation. And I like this line. I can't take credit for it, but it's simply that there are plenty of virtues which we have and need, like courage and compassion and wisdom and hope. And the scripture is replete, not only with moral commands, but potent descriptions of habitual dispositions to act excellently. Isn't that a great line? Perpetual dispositions to act excellently. Because, as Lou Smedes from Fuller Seminary said, possibility becomes certainty. Amen? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. So as I said, the format for this session, we'll have one or two questions for Richard right now, and then later on we'll have a free-for-all after all the speakers. But I thank you. John Courtney Murray, by the way, was not only Catholic, but also Jesuit.
Yes,
I have to point that out at St. Louis University. But definitely no pew potatoes wherever you preach, I think. There's going to be people that are going to have to act. So what questions do we have from the audience? Right here, in the front here.
So thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed that, but here's the problem I'm having.
Yep.
As a scientist, I often get that message. I need to reach out to broader communities with what I have to say, which I try and do. As a Democrat, I hear I have to reach out across the aisle to Republicans, and I completely get that. What I don't know, I don't believe, but maybe I'm wrong, is that same message is being sent across the aisle to the evangelical churches or to the Republicans, and they're being told, you have to reach out to scientists.
No, they're not being told that.
And so I also hear you say there's information bias. It doesn't matter what a scientist is going to tell you. They're never going to believe me. So where does that?
No, they're not going to believe
where
you
does
if
that
you're
put
just
me?
distantly giving them information, because information is going to sway them. And in other words, the people who are persuaded the most, who are persuaded by people they know the most. So you can start with your family. I called mine and I said, I'm doing this live streaming there in Oregon, and they don't believe in climate change. So hello out there in Oregon, Washington. I hope you're listening. I don't know if I answered your question, but no, I don't believe that they're being told to reach out to us or to you, the scientists. Absolutely not. You know what they call you. Green lizards. These are the religious right leaders of Jerry Falwell, Jim Dobson, and et al., who are saying about the scientific community, don't trust them, they're not worthy of this, and they're lying to you, and it's all a conspiracy. So the other side isn't being told what I'm saying, or what Mitch will say.
Maybe my question is, you're speaking to the wrong audience.
No. Well, yeah. I mean, this is my normal audience. You're right. Not too many scientists invite me. I'm an evangelical. They have a big, big hurdle just to even invite me. Now, this gentleman back here has had his hand up, and I have to tell you a secret about people who are preachers. When you are preaching, especially on Sunday morning where there's a lot of light, you pick out one person in the audience who you can somehow make some eye contact with, and when they start to fall asleep, you know you have trouble. And you, sir, are the person whose face I was watching. So you probably have a really bad question.
Actually, it's a really informational question.
Yeah.
So I try to reach out to a lot of different groups. I just ask, who would you here in St. Louis, or if you can give me any cues for how would I find?
Call up the local Missouri Interfaith Power and Light group. I happen to be
Okay.
on the board in Virginia,
Okay. Yeah.
and I've alerted them to be watching, and
Okay.
we're having a host meeting in my home on May 20th to invite people, and you can be darn sure I will be inviting some professors from the University of Mary Washington.
Cool. Tracy's a really good friend of mine, so
Good.
that's
I haven't yet met her while here, but I'm just applauding
Okay.
the Interfaith Power as a way to network and reach out. I wish I could say that the evangelicals would be that way, but it's an interfaith group, and there are evangelicals within IPL.
perfect. Thanks much.
That's what I would do.
All right. As I said, we'll go on to our next speaker. Let's thank Richard again for his presentation.